Welcome everybody to the second Children's Social Care Innovation Programme webinar. This webinar is about scaling and spreading innovation. What does this mean and how do we do it? My name is Vicky Purwell and I'm part of Spring Consortium, which is the delivery partner working with the Department for Education on the programme. I have with me here David Albury. He's a director of the Innovation Unit, one of the organisations making up the Spring Consortium, and he has worked with governments and public services around the world to develop and implement innovation and scaling strategies. So before I ask David to tell us a bit about scaling and spreading innovation, I'll let you know how the next hour will work. David's going to speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for clarifying questions. After that, we'd like to get into a discussion about what this means for you, for local authorities and other organisations who are working on new ways to deliver better outcomes for children in and on the edge of care. We have one particular bidder to the programme, somebody who's been working on a proposal, who we know has been thinking about their approach to scale quite a lot over the last couple of months. This is the Fostering Network, and later I will ask Phil from Fostering Network and Louise, their Spring Consortium coach, to tell you a bit about what they've been doing. Then we'll open up for discussions about what you've heard and how that might apply to your own work. And we're really interested in any experiences you have as well about the issues and how you've been thinking at an early stage in your work about how your innovations might have an impact at a bigger scale. You'll find your lines are currently on mute. During the opportunities to ask questions and during the discussion, we'll unmute your lines. You might also want to keep your own phone on mute and just unmute it if you'd like to speak. That way we can try and limit the number or the amount of background noise. You can also ask a question by typing it into the instant messenger box, which is on the left-hand side of your screen for those of you who are logged in online. And if you type a question there, everyone will see it. And we'll keep an eye on those coming through. And I think the last thing to say before I hand over to David is just that we're recording. So we'll put the recording of this webinar on the Spring Consortium website in the next few weeks. So if you bear that in mind as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Albury and ask him to share some insights on spreading and scaling innovation. David.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And it's a pleasure to do this webinar this afternoon. I have the great privilege of working in different countries around the world and often get invited by government departments to visit sites of innovation, to visit great schools or great hospitals or great prisons or great local authorities. And just occasionally they let me out on my own, and when I walk around, rather than visiting the model sites or the beacon sites, we find that much of social care practice, of schooling, of healthcare is just the same as it was maybe 20, even 50 years ago. So the problem that we're trying to deal with is often that innovation stays locked on location. It doesn't spread. It often doesn't spread across an authority, let alone from one authority to another, let alone from one country to another. So what I thought I'd do today is just share with you some of the reasons why traditional methods of scaling and diffusion don't work, and then to just indicate three approaches which different places around the world, including some of the projects in this programme, are adopting in order to improve scaling and diffusion. So I'll first just talk a little about the mistaken assumptions about scaling. And as you're listening to this or looking at the slides, you may think, hang on a moment, these are what I work with. And that's the point, really. These assumptions are indeed myths about how scaling and diffusion happens. So I'm just going to go through the 5 of them relatively quickly. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, is the myth that scaling and adoption are just informational issues. In many programs that I work with, when we receive project proposals or look at particular bids, what people are saying when it comes to the section on scaling and diffusion is we're going to run a workshop, we'll have a conference, we'll do a website, we'll write a pamphlet. And the research and experience over 40 years shows that these mechanisms are of limited effectiveness. Secondly, the second assumption that is common is that practices, new models in social care, new models in education, in healthcare, spread and scale through moving from one area to another, transferring from one organization to another. But if we study how particularly radical innovations spread, we find they as often spread, or in fact more commonly spread, through the organization which originates the innovation, increasing its share of the sector or of the market. That is, that they scale and displace existing providers. So the effect of that is to decommission less effective, less high-performing providers and increase the scale or sectoral share that new, innovative, more high-performing providers have. Thirdly, is that the third myth is that there is, if you like, a linear or a sequence between innovation and diffusion, innovation and scaling. And so all too often one sees in programs around the world, people talk about we'll do a pilot and then we'll roll it out. In fact, what we find is that those processes which are most effective in scaling and diffusion are not those processes which treat those two as separate, but think about scaling and diffusion from the beginning, but have in place scaling strategies as they begin to develop their innovative practices. Fourthly, is the myth that if we just have more and more innovation, surely some of them will stick. The sort of pipeline notion. Or for those of you who have more of an economic bent, we could say that there is an overemphasis on supply side policies in relation to innovation and insufficient attention to the demand side of innovation, of adoption and scaling. And fifthly, and perhaps most controversially, is that we tend to think that innovation spread and diffuse through the key agencies of professionals, that is in social care, that if we could only get social workers to talk to each other and spread practice, that this would be an effective method of scaling and diffusion. But what we find in many cases is that in fact it is user demand, a broader set of demand, that is as effective, in fact more effective, in scaling and diffusion than relying totally on networks of professionals. So those are the 5 myths of scaling. So I now want to say something about 3 approaches that are proving to be more effective in the scaling and diffusion of innovative practices. Firstly is what has been labelled the organic growth model. And this is based on the notion that rather than saying there's just a group of people who do the innovation and then we leave the rest of the world alone until the innovation has been developed, proven, tested and refined, what we seek to do is to engage in a community of engagement potential early adopters of that innovation or set of innovations as, if you like, critical friends to the innovators. So the innovators are in this community of practice, developing, refining, testing and prototyping innovations. And the community of engagement are people who are potential adopters of that innovation, who are providing critical friendship, who are adding their thoughts, their views. But critically, they are doing one other thing. Critically, as they're doing this, they are thinking about how would that innovation engage in, take place in, take root in the locality or authority in which I am based. Many of you will have heard the expression of not invented here, and indeed there is a kernel of truth in that regard. Radical innovations rarely spread, as it were, with complete fidelity to their original site or location, but need to be adapted and translated into different contexts and circumstances. So the community of engagement is the group of potential early adopters who are critiquing, refining and thinking about how the innovations might work in their practice. And then the third community are those people who say, well, I'm not really ready yet to be a potential adopter. I'm interested, keep me involved. They are more the people that we might engage through conferences and exhibitions, workshops and seminars and newsletters and so forth. But they're not, if you like, that pool of potential early adopters. And the secret, for those of you looking at the slides, the notion of this organic growth is how do we begin to move out the community of practice, grow the community of practice such that it enfolds potential adopters, grow the community of engagement through pulling in and recruiting a community of interest. So that's the organic growth model. And I ought to say these three approaches are not necessarily separate. People often combine them. A great example, if you want to look, before I move on to the second one, is just on organic growth, is just the New York City I-Zone, rather celebrated, but is a program to transform the New York public school system, which started with just 20 out of the 1,600 schools in New York, but has over 4 years grown. Some 400 of the schools in New York City are now involved, if you like, in the community of practice. They were in the community of engagement, they've been recruited in. The second approach derives more from the thinking and development around social movements. And if you want to hold two examples in your head here, the two examples would be around personalised budgets. Personalised budgets did not originate and have not scaled and diffused through the action particularly of professional networks or government policy, but particularly through disability rights organisations and movements of people living with disabilities who have pressed for more control over their care, treatment and living facilities. Or if you like, another example where we've seen significant transformation over the last decade is in the care and treatment of people living with HIV/AIDS. Both of these new practices, new models, new services spread much more through galvanizing a social movement. And these social movements have 4 key elements to them. Firstly, they always have a really strong, compelling case for change. Not something that's 15 volumes long with lots of statistical appendices, but they can often be a short cartoon, a short video, a very punchy document that really lays out why this particular change is necessary, why it's important to really change the model of services that we have at the moment. Secondly, they always have some inspiring or guiding vision. Again, not some fantastically detailed. Interestingly, around the world, these visions tend to be sort of a single slide with 5 or 6 elements to them. But they have something that guides this process, that glues together this social movement. And then it has 2 other features. One is that it actively connects user and professional networks, networks of citizens, networks of children, networks of parents, with networks of professionals to work together to diffuse, to scale, and to spread the practices. And to do that, it's critical that all the people within those networks have what is labelled on this slide, in slightly light text, as participation pathways. This is the notion that there is not just one way of engaging with this, providing a variety of ways in which people can engage in this social movement. So the example I always like is to think of Greenpeace, where you don't have to chain yourself to the front of a trawler to be a member of Greenpeace. You can just give out a local newsletter, you can collect plastic bags. There's a whole variety of different ways in which you can engage and be part of this social movement. Thirdly and finally, and perhaps more prosaically but equally important, is an approach which looks at issues around enabling conditions. What are the policy frameworks? What are the funding regimes? What are the regulatory frameworks? What are the incentives that can increase the likelihood of innovations going to scale? And critically around this are issues about commissioning or payment for outcomes. We know that in systems that have commissioning and payment for outcomes, there is a greater drive to take up innovation. We know also that it's critical about how sectors are regulated. Going back to one of the issues I raised at the beginning, is the regulatory environment one that sufficiently will allow great, innovative, high-performing organisations to scale their provision and to enable the decommissioning of less high-performing, less successful organisations. So there has to be channels for licensing, for franchising, for accrediting, for the building of what are often chains of schools. So we have 5 myths to hold in one's head about the 5 mistaken assumptions about scaling and diffusion, and around the world 3 more promising, more effective approaches there. So I hope I've sufficiently whetted your appetite for this question to have a great discussion. Thank you.